Hello, I'm Theo, and today I'm going to talk about viruses. Let's start with the 5 criteria for whether something is alive or not. Let's start with something that we know is alive, like a cat. A cat uses and produces energy. They are made up of many cells. They grow and develop. They can reproduce, create more organisms, and they require nutrients and create waste products. This means a cat is alive. But what about something that almost fills the requirements, like fire? Fire requires energy to start and produces heat and light energy once it is lit. While fire doesn't respire or breathe in the same way that humans or plants do, it does require oxygen to keep burning. It is certainly not made up of cells, and while we often refer to fire as growing, this growth is better described as spreading. It definitely doesn't reproduce in the sexual or asexual way that other living organisms do. Fire does require fuel, heat, and oxygen to burn, which could be described as nutrients, I suppose. And waste products like ash, smoke, and CO2 are created. However, since fire does not meet all the 5 characteristics of living things, it is not alive. But what about viruses? When I began this project, I was certain that viruses were not alive. After all, viruses do not produce their own energy, and they cannot respire. Rather, they are parasites that attach to a host and use their host's metabolism to get energy. They are not made up of cells, but instead are composed of a genetic material, RNA or DNA, that has a protein coat called a capsid around it. Viruses also do not grow or develop like other living things, but they do evolve over time. Do viruses reproduce? Scientists say that they replicate since they need a host cell to make copies of themselves. So this is a little bit of a gray area. However, viruses are inactive out of a host, so do not require nutrients or create waste products. In addition, some virologists say that since viruses cannot maintain a stable environment within themselves, they are not alive. So the bottom line is, there's a lot of debate in the scientific community about whether viruses are alive or not. Nobody seems to agree where viruses would belong on the tree of life. Some even say that viruses are like vines that wrap themselves around the tree. It seems, by this definition, viruses are not alive. However, I watched this Veritasium video explaining the theory of the selfish gene, and here is what I learned. Billions of years ago, when life first started on Earth, the first steps towards life was something called self-replicating compounds that evolved over millions of years from ribonucleic acid, or RNA, which is part of what viruses are made of. According to this theory of the selfish gene, everything that is not RNA, like DNA, cells, plants, animals, and humans, all evolved to protect and give an advantage to these self-replicating compounds. The definition of alive feels a little bit arbitrary. Not all scientists even have the same list of criteria to judge whether something is alive or not. If everything that we define as being alive is just really there to protect and replicate these self-replicating compounds, wouldn't it be fair to consider viruses as a very primitive form of life? If you are interested in watching the Veritasium video, follow the QR code displayed on the screen to learn more about this fascinating ideology. Viruses don't just come in one shape. In fact, they can come in 4 different shapes: helical, polyhedral, spherical, and complex viruses. However, within each of these huge classes, there are many different subclasses. Therefore, this doesn't mean that all spherical viruses look the same. And different viruses have different proteins on them to enter different cells. For example, Ebola is a helical virus, whereas polio is a polyhedral virus. COVID-19 is a spherical virus, and the herpes virus is a complex virus. It is also interesting to note that viruses are 100 to 1,000 times smaller than the cells in your body. They are also much tinier than bacteria, You definitely need an electron microscope to see them. A virus reproduces in several stages. The virus first attaches itself to the host cell and then begins the process of invading the host cell. It does this by passing through the cell membrane. Not every virus can attach to every kind of cell. This is why not every virus can infect every kind of animal or human. If the virus is compatible, it enters the host cell, and as it is entering, it grabs proteins on the host cell to help with the entry process. Once inside, the virus starts the uncoating stage. In this stage, the capsid, which is a protective layer over the virus, gets broken down, and the RNA, the instructions to build the virus, are released into the cell. Because your cells already use RNA instructions to replicate themselves, the cell sees the RNA instructions and gets to work making new proteins. This is the virus hijacking the host cell's reproductive system so it can replicate and start to assemble new viruses. That stage is called replication. The last step is release. This is when the new viruses exit the host cell and begin the whole process again, infecting a new host cell. Remember, this only takes a few hours to complete and start again. Here is a direct comparison of a virus versus a bacteria. Here are some interesting points. You can fight against viruses with vaccines, but with bacteria, you need antibiotics. If you expose bacteria to antibiotics constantly, you run the risk of having the bacteria become resistant against antibiotics, and then it becomes very difficult to treat this mutated bacteria. Viruses also evolve. For example, scientists make new flu vaccines every year to target the new virus more effectively. Viruses are mostly RNA-based, however bacteria is based off of DNA only. RNA are simple, easy to follow replication instructions, whereas DNA is more robust and more stable over the long term. To replicate viruses, you need to hijack a host cell, but bacteria can reproduce itself with no help required through asexual reproduction. Viruses are either neutral or parasitic, versus bacteria that can be neutral, symbiotic, or parasitic. For example, we depend on beneficial bacteria in our gut microbiome to keep us healthy. These are some viral and bacterial illnesses. And here are some interesting tidbits about some of these diseases. You may have heard that measles caused by a virus is making a comeback. This is because there are enough people in the world who did not get their measles vaccine when they were young. One of the reasons for this was due to the COVID-19 pandemic, also caused by a virus, which disrupted their vaccine schedules. Measles has also made a comeback because lots of people fall for misinformation online about the safety of vaccines. This spring, you may have to watch out for the Lyme disease if you are spending time in nature. If a tick that is carrying the bacteria bites you, you can get infected with this disease, unless you get treatment within the first 24 hours. The earlier you receive antibiotics, the greater your chance at a full recovery without complications. Did you know that there are 10 million viruses in a teaspoon of seawater? There are more viruses in the ocean than bacteria and phytoplankton. Indeed, if you took all the viruses in the ocean and lined them up, they would stretch more than 60 galaxies long. Studying marine viruses is a relatively new area of research. Most of us think negatively about viruses, but viruses in the ocean actually play many important roles. One of the things that they do is attack bacteria, which is good because it prevents the bacteria populations from getting too large. When a virus, also called a bacteriophage, gets inside the bacterial cell, it replicates and eventually the bacteria explodes, throwing bits of nutrients and energy into the water for other organisms to use. Viruses are clearly amazing recyclers. Marine viruses also have another important role in the oceans. Believe it or not, they actually help increase the amount of oxygen that is produced for us to breathe. For every 2 breaths that we inhale, one of them is actually produced by the ocean cyanobacteria through photosynthesis. Cyanobacteria's common name is actually blue-green algae. When marine viruses attack the cyanobacteria, it bursts and sinks to the bottom of the ocean. This creates a nutrient-rich area for more cyanobacteria to grow, which makes more oxygen for us to breathe. Interestingly enough, this same process is also what sequesters or locks away carbon at the bottom of the ocean for thousands of years. When viruses burst open the cyanobacteria, the carbon particles become sticky, clump together, and sink down to the bottom of the ocean. This prevents the carbon from joining with two oxygen molecules and becoming CO2, slowing down global warming. Originally, I thought viruses could only make our lives miserable, but now I know that in our oceans, they are extremely beneficial, even life-giving. I hope that this ocean research is publicized more so that humans might be encouraged to protect our oceans, not just for marine mammals that live there, but also for the viruses that are doing important work to stabilize our climate. Thanks for watching.